the capacitor takes some of the charge that normally would have gone into overcharging that cell, and then with various electronic switches, it can then move that capacitor over to the cell that's flatter, and then discharge the capacitor into the cell that's flat. So now while you're charging this battery, current is being moved from this one to this capacitor and then put back into this cell, allowing this cell to charge up faster. Well, this cell doesn't see really any charge current because the charge is being pulled off via the capacitor and the battery management system. So all of those requires a lot of active electronics, and there's quite a lot of specialized circuitry to do this. And it means that the output of your battery is now not just a function of what's going on with these cells, but it also depends what's going on with this circuitry. And that's one more liability as far as things that can go wrong. So when we were first getting into lithium packs in 2004, there wasn't a whole lot available in off-the-shelf battery management circuits. And as a way of overcoming the fact that you needed to balance these cells, some of the companies, a lot of them at the time, weren't supplying any management circuit, but they provided you with a battery charger that had 10 separate chargers in it, and then it would individually charge up each of the 10 cells. And that way, when you charge the battery, you don't have to charge all the cells at the same time. When one cell is fully charged, it can just stop charging because it's got its own charging circuit, and then a cell that's flatter can sit there charging for longer. So great, so now when you're charging it, you can bring all the cells into balance. So then you have nothing to protect you while you're discharging the battery against draining it too flat. So that's, of course, what happened. And when you drain, this is a Thunder-style lithium-ion battery pack, and I think it lasted maybe 4 months before something happened and one of the cells was short-circuited internally. Well, it's fine. We had spare cells. We replaced it. The spare cells, then it worked again, and then a few months later, we have another internal short circuit. And I still have this lying around. I think it went around, and now like 5 or 6 of them are all just short-circuited at random over the ensuing years of being in storage. And it also is problematic because you're relying now on an 11-pin connector between your charger and your battery pack to complete the circuit between each individual charger and each individual cell. But what if one of those pins doesn't make contact? Now you've charged up 9 of the cells, and the 10th cell doesn't get any charge. There is no contact made on the pin. You have no real way of knowing this, and then you go to drain the battery. There's no circuitry that will cut it off, and you've just killed that. So definitely not a consumer-ready solution for dealing with balancing lithium battery packs. So at the end of the day, most companies were making or supplying their batteries with battery management circuits, which look like this, and there's a whole bunch of different connections to connect to each of the cells inside the battery pack. And then there's power transistors that you can see here, and that's the switch that turns on or off the charging or discharging port to stop the battery from overcharging or over-discharging. But they themselves become a huge source of problems and headaches. One, they need to be physically protected. So here's a case where a battery management circuit on the outside of the cell gets crushed. That short-circuited various pins together, and then the battery management circuit ceases to function. In this case, it didn't cause any smoke or do damage, but it meant that you couldn't charge or discharge the battery. It just remained in an open circuit kind of failure. Another thing that happened a lot on the early battery packs is that just out of the blue, you buy it and the battery management circuit would trip out. And you know that you still have power in the battery. The voltage was, you've only drained 20% of the pack. And then you wonder what's going on. You unplug it, you plug it in, and then it works again. And you keep on riding. And then it trips out again. And this time you unplug it and plug it in, and nothing happens. There's no voltage on the output. And so you pedal all the way home, and you put the battery on the shelf, and then you go to complain. And then the next day, you measure it, and there's still no voltage on the output. And then 2 days later you measure it, and suddenly there's voltage on the output again. And the battery management has decided to turn on or wake up or unlatch itself. So they tended to just latch in a state where they would shut off, and for reasons that were unpredictable and unknown to us. So here you can see one where the battery is perfectly fine. If you measure the voltage where you charge it, which sort of bypasses the battery management circuit, it's 37.9 volts. If you measure the voltage on the output, it's 19.2. When we opened up this battery and measured all the individual cells, every cell was at 3.79 volts, which is a perfectly healthy voltage to be at. But for some reason, the circuit was tripped, and it wasn't allowing the current to flow through the output. So we faced a lot of headaches like that. There's another common problem, which is that the battery management circuit can only handle so much current, and they have to design it, the switches that turn the current on and off to handle the current that's flowing through the e-bike. So we would always specify that we need a battery that can deliver 20 amps or 30 amps or 40 amps, whatever a bicycle needed. And often they would be able to do that for a short amount of time, but if it had that current for too long, then it would overheat or it would trip for its own reason. So here's a battery pack where I was discharging it at 18 amps of current, and the bikes will drop to 20 amps. So this is a very realistic scenario if you were to go up a long hill, and it's fine. You get 2 amp hours, and all of a sudden it trips out. So I unplug the battery, turn it back on, get another little bit, turn it down. I just repeated this process, and you can see that eventually the battery gives capacity, but it can't do it at the current that it's rated to give it at least not continuously. But it can for short time. So if you go up a short hill at 20 amps, you'd be okay. So sometimes these problems wouldn't be apparent or wouldn't manifest themselves for a lot of people, and then a couple of people might have a particularly long hill or a heavy load to carry, and then they'd have their battery always tripping on them. This was also a battery that was supposed to give 12 amp hours, but it only did 8, and that was a very current with the early lithiums that we saw. One big danger about this situation is that we have all of these wires connecting the cells to the circuit board. Now, we put fuses on the output wires, so if you short circuit, you're fine. But we now have this huge collection of cables, thin wires, going scattered throughout the pack, coming to a common board, and nothing's protecting these together. So if you were to mash the battery or get into an accident, you could cause a short between these wires, and then you're directly short-circuiting these cells, again, without the circuit that can prevent any, without any fusing or anything in the circuitry to shut that off. So here's a situation where I had a battery charging in my basement, and lo and behold, there's a small electrical fire going on. It is a concrete floor. And the battery charger seemed fine. There was no sign that any of the cells had been damaged. What had clearly happened is that some of the wires, so the wires go from these cells, and here's where the battery management circuit is, and they were completely vaporized. There's actually blobs of molten copper on the pavement. And during the charging process, I think that the battery management circuit, when this is one of the battery management circuits that bleeds off the extra charge on the overcharged cell, and it gets hot. And it could have gotten hot enough that it softened the insulation on the sense wires that connect the cells to the circuit, allowing you to get copper on copper contact, and then that causes a short circuit, which causes an electrical fire with the ensuing meltdown that occurred here. This can be a really serious problem. Here are some more batteries that have a battery management circuit here, and then cable going along the cells under the heat shrink to that circuitry. And these ones actually, in transit, got bounced around and whatever, and that presumably crushed some of those wires against the tabs, allowed a short circuit to happen, allowed a little electrical inferno to happen in a box. So this was sample battery packs as we received them. It's an interesting problem because it's something that virtually every single lithium battery pack that I've ever opened or taken apart is vulnerable to this. So this is a really high quality, well-performing lithium battery, but I open up the casing and you have all these thin wires all against, going right up against this metal can over to the circuitry. Well, this battery is meant to be mounted, so this is the top surface of the battery. And so there's no real pressure between the wires and the metal can, sure. But no one's going to guarantee that you're always going to put the battery that way. Some people might mount it on their bike upside down. Then you have the weight of all these cells pressing on these plastic wires. So there is several layers of protection. I mean, you have the heat shrink over the cell, there's the insulation on the wires, and this is plastic rather than metal. But at the end of the day, if you have dozens or hundreds of these out and people riding on bumpy roads, you just don't know what could potentially wear through and cause an electrical short inside the battery because of the wires to the battery management circuit. The solution